Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a list of what are some of my personal least favorite things that are currently going on within publishing, within fantasy books. I did ask all of you over on my Instagram what are your current worst trends in fantasy, so I will be doing a follow-up video reacting to some of the things that you can't stand, but I'm selfishly just talking about the things that I can't stand right now, and I'm sure there's going to be some overlap between what I say here and what all of you have said. I'm just going to jump right into it though, and the first one that I want to start with would be audiobooks, and sometimes ebooks I believe as well, that aren't available internationally. So this isn't necessarily specific to fantasy books, it's just that I primarily read fantasy, and so this is something I've experienced within fantasy, but I'm sure this happens in other genres as well. So if you read a little more broadly than I do, feel free to let me know times that you've had this same issue. But what I'm talking about, and being a little bit more specific here, I'll give an example of the Winnowing Flame trilogy by Jen Williams, which is a trilogy I was not shutting up about for like 2 years straight. And I loved that trilogy. I kind of picked it up on a whim. It was definitely a hidden gem. I tried it out and I loved the first book, Ninth Reign, and then I had to get the second and third books through an international retailer. I also am a big fan of audiobooks, so then I was thinking, well, maybe I can listen to the audiobook a little bit too, and I saw that it wasn't available. And so that was it in my mind. Oh, there's just no audiobook for this series. And then I mentioned to all of you, because some people were saying like, oh, I really like audiobooks, is there an audiobook? And I was like, no, sadly. And then some people were saying, yes, there is. I don't know why I always do this, like you're typing aggressively. But anyway, some people were like, yeah, there's an audiobook. And I looked and I was like, not here. It was only available, I believe, for people in the UK. And selfishly, I will admit, that irritates me from the standpoint of, like, but I want it. So there's that aspect of this that I don't like. But looking beyond that, I don't understand, and if somebody wants to enlighten me and maybe you have more knowledge about this, feel free to share. I don't understand how this isn't a con for the author, because there were a lot of people, for a variety of different reasons, that they prefer the audiobook, or they only read audiobooks. Some people have vision issues. It makes it very difficult for them to consume a story via a physical copy. So there were people that were saying, I really want to read this series, but it's not available where I live. I can't listen to the audiobook where I live. And I don't understand, because then you have all these people that want to consume this story. You have a bunch of people that want to try it out, to support this author. Some people are really sweet and they'll buy a physical copy and then they'll want to get other forms of the book as well to support the author, especially if it's not a big name. And they couldn't do that. And I was just thinking, how is this not negatively affecting Jen Williams? And then on top of that, the physical copies, while you could get them in at least the US, I don't know what it was like for people who lived outside the US, while you could get them in the US, some people ran into the issue of the stock ran out, or it was a lot more expensive to have it shipped. So I get the physical copies being an issue if you only have a certain amount of stock, or maybe the retailer is located in a certain country and distribution is not the easiest. That I understand. I just don't understand, especially if that's the case, why you would limit who can listen to the audiobook. It makes no sense to me. I had hoped this wasn't an issue that I would necessarily run into continuously, but just recently I wanted to pick up the new release God Killer, and it's got the same exact scenario where the audiobook is not available outside of, I believe, the UK. Maybe there are some other countries that have access to it, but I don't here in the US. And I will say you can use a VPN to trick the computer into thinking you live elsewhere. And so I did end up just recently downloading the audiobook, because I like to have the audiobook, and because I currently don't have a physical copy anyway, because it's not being sold in US retailers, and the UK I think has some stuff going on with strikes and their mailing and things like that. So the audiobook was how I was going to listen to this story. I like trying to keep up with new releases, let you all know about them, and I could not do that. So again, this is likely a thing that happens outside of fantasy, but this has happened a few times now with fantasy specific books, and it drives me up a wall. It took a while to get through that first point. So switching gears and getting into another trend that is a little frustrating to me. So I have noticed, and this I actually like, that standalones in fantasy and shorter fantasy books are becoming more popular. And I used to be always really on the fence when I would see a book that was really short, because I am always thinking, well, I feel like fantasy takes so much time. You have to establish the world, you have to establish how the magic works, if there is magic, the politics. But there are some really skilled authors who tell lovely stories within a very short amount of pages. And that's a really exciting one because it's more stories that you can consume, but also for people that are getting into fantasy or maybe are a little intimidated by fantasy, there are so many more entry points now that make it so much more accessible. So that's really exciting. However, the price tag makes 0 sense to me because some of these books are really short and they cost basically the same thing as books that are much longer. So I actually want to play a little game for a second. It's not really a game, it's just you guess. So Nettle and Bone is an example of what I'm talking about. This book is less than 250 pages. Another book that also came out last year, because this came out in 2022, would be The Art of Prophecy. Over twice as long as Nettle and Bone. How much do you think Nettle and Bone is, and how much do you think The Art of Prophecy is, or what do you think the price difference is between these two books? So, the reveal, Nettle and Bone is $25.99. This tiny book is $25.99. This other book, which is quite large and, again, over twice as long, is $28.99. A $3 difference. A $3 difference, really? And there's a part of me that wants to give benefit of the doubt and recognize, well, I bet the binding costs a decent amount, and I don't know what pages they use. I don't know what could contribute to the first option, Nettle and Bone, being so expensive. The reason I have a hard time giving such benefit of the doubt, though, is because if this were a young adult book, it would probably be at least $10 cheaper. It's just it being in the adult fantasy section immediately makes the price a lot higher, and I don't know if that has to do with publishers knowing that adult fantasy books are likely being purchased by adults, whereas young adult books, maybe it's a kid and the parent is purchasing it, and so the parent might be a little less likely, or maybe they figure if the price tag is lower, the parent might buy more books for their child, and so in the long run, it makes them more money. I'm not really sure, but at the end of the day, I just feel like they're jacking up the price, and I'm all for T. Kingfisher. If she's the one making the money for it, great. But I have a feeling that the publisher probably makes a decent amount off of that high price point for a short book, because it's not like the printing costs all that much, especially given, again, a $3 difference for a book that's twice as large. Those first few points were definitely on the sillier side. They're much more trivial than what this next point is going to be, and I want to try to be very clear about this next point because it is a more serious topic. So, books that focus on groups that are typically not represented as often, publishing seems to really only like to show those groups through the lens of trauma. And if you're kind of confused as to what I mean by that, you can kind of take any group that is typically not as well represented or is not represented as often and look at the kinds of stories that you're usually seeing with those groups. So I'm going to use the example of just being a woman because I don't want to speak for anyone else. So I do think that for a while, women in fantasy, a lot of times we were kind of accessories, or we were the kinds of characters that were there to motivate another character to push their story along. We were the love interests. But a lot of times we were the character that had some kind of violence happen to, some kind of sexual violence happen to, or there would just be some kind of sexism that was launched at that character. And eventually we got to a point where we were focusing on the female character in the story, but it felt like so many of the books were just like, these are the only things that we can see women going through. It was like we were always seeing them having to face such harsh realities. And I don't want to say that those aren't important stories, because they absolutely are. Those are things that realistically do happen. And for a lot of people, it is almost cathartic to see a character going through something like that. You can heal alongside them. You can push through these things alongside them, or you can just feel seen by them. So I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't have stories like that. But eventually we got to a point where now the female characters can be heroes of the story. They can be fully fleshed out characters. And we've actually started to swing so far that we're going into the other direction where they're, they're basically impenetrable to all bad things. You cannot bring them down. They never have moments of weakness, and it's the, like the strong female character that we're starting to get frustrated with because now they have no flaws. And so we've kind of seen this full cycle of the kinds of characters you can get, and hopefully eventually we'll kind of focus in and we'll continue to just get really amazing, fully fleshed out characters that happen to be women. So where I'm going with this, though, is there's a certain part of that process that I was talking about where we start to really just see these characters through the lens of trauma, is what I was saying. So in the example of women, it's like, okay, well, this character, there's always something awful happening to her. There's always some kind of sexual violence or sexism occurring against her. It's like you see other groups in fantasy where that is where publishing has locked in the kinds of stories that you can get. And you don't get the joyful stories, you don't get the fun stories, you don't get the heroic stories, you just get the ones where we're seeing them through this lens. And again, I'm not trying to say that those aren't important. We need all kinds of stories, but that's the thing, is we need all kinds of stories, not just the ones that are consistently showing those characters being traumatized. And on top of that, publishing tends to love to push those stories when traumatic things are happening worldwide. When there's some kind of news story that breaks, suddenly publishing, it is a trend to now push books out. It's like, oh yeah, look here, this is trendy right now, and it's gross. It feels gross. And on top of that, I would say a lot of times when they're so eager to push these books out, they end up jeopardizing the careers of the authors because they don't put the same amount of editing into those books that probably they deserve to have. And they probably don't put as much into the cover design and the marketing. It's kind of like, well, this national tragedy will take care of the marketing for us, is what it can come across like. So let's just try to represent everybody in all pockets of life. The last thing I'll point out, and this is just another sillier one, is this trend of constantly putting out new covers for older works. Now, I will say, all of us do not like getting cover changes mid-series. That's not really what I'm talking about, although I can't stand that also. But I'm talking about how older fantasy books will continue to get beautiful edition after beautiful edition, and then another new edition, and now here's a new trade paperback copy, and then also here's just a new cover, and they keep getting all these new editions, these new covers, and I just can't help but think, wouldn't it be nice if we just put that money towards the little guy? Wouldn't it be nice if we took authors that maybe it's their first book and they could use a little bit of help because we want to get their name out there. The other books are going to continue to sell. They'll continue to sell. And I understand that publishing is a business, and likely the money they make reprinting and selling older works, maybe that does contribute to helping these other authors. Maybe it helps them sign more authors and put money into marketing for new authors. But I feel like there has to be like a happy medium because, and I'll give an example of a book that I really like. And I am somebody who likes to have lots of editions of books, but okay, Mistborn. I love Mistborn, but they just got new trade paperbacks, and then now they're getting new covers again. And I'm like, how many covers do we need for Mistborn? And also, I don't love most of them. Can they get ones that, it doesn't matter. Anyway, I'm sure there are other examples that you can think of here, but that's it for some trends in fantasy that currently are frustrations for me, and I'm sure that you all have a lot of your own thoughts regarding this. I would love to know not just your thoughts on these, which I would like to know, but also what are some trends that you personally can't stand. Like I said, I'll be doing a follow-up video where I'll be reacting to some of the worst trends in fantasy that you all have mentioned. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.